Good morning. Welcome to week 5 of Religion and Life Online. Over this week and just a little bit in week 6, I'm going to shoot just a couple of videos here in my office to talk with you about the conversation we're having with the two books, The Cross-Centered Life and Crazy Love. These will be very short. You already have the PowerPoints, you have the handouts, you have the book, so you don't have to watch these. But if you do want to hear just my perspective on a few of these topics, these will be less than 10 minutes and available for you to watch along with your book, your handouts, and the PowerPoints that are online. First, let me just tell you a little about the book The Cross-Centered Life. The Cross-Centered Life was written by C.J. Mahaney several years ago. At that point, he was the pastor of Covenant Life Church in Gaithersburg, Maryland. He is a leader of a denomination called Sovereign Grace. Sovereign Grace is mostly based in New England and parts of Ohio, Pennsylvania, but there are several Sovereign Grace churches elsewhere in the U.S. This book really was to counter the idea of the purpose-driven life. Many of you may have read Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life. It's a great book. But it really talks more about the purpose of us in God's kingdom. The Cross-Centered Life says something else. It says, what must we as Christians center our life in the most? What is the most important thing, the most main thing that we can center our life in? And that is in the cross of Jesus Christ. This particular week, or this class, Restating the Obvious, comes from one of the first chapters of the book. And I just want to highlight a few things for you. The section in the opening, Restating the Obvious, is referring to the book of 2 Timothy. It's a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a protege named Timothy. Paul was in prison, and Paul was experiencing the ending of his life. And he wanted to give some instructions to his young friend and son in the faith, Timothy, about how to lead the people in a city called Ephesus. And he writes to him several really passionate things. They talked about their relationship with one another and how he wants Timothy to continue to fan the flame, and to remember the way he was brought up. But he comes to the most important section, I think, for the book. He says, therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord. Don't be ashamed of it, Timothy, nor of me, his prisoner, but share in suffering for the gospel by the power of God, who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace. I am not ashamed. For I know whom I have believed, and am convinced that he is able to guard until that day what has been entrusted. Paul was not ashamed of Jesus, and he did not want Timothy to be ashamed of Jesus. He goes on in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8, to give the main thing. The main instruction he wanted to leave his protege. The main thing he wanted to pass on to Timothy so that Timothy could pass on to others. He said, remember Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, a descendant of David, according to my gospel. Remember Jesus Christ, Timothy. If you want to center your life on anything, you remember Jesus. You remember that he didn't just die on the cross. He rose again in the resurrection. He is a descendant of David. That makes him a king, a ruler, a significant authority in all of our lives. But he says, according to my gospel, that my gospel is the most important part. The gospel is a word that means the good news of Jesus Christ. It's the good news that Jesus came to earth, that he lived a perfect, sinless life, that he did many miracles and taught wonderful things, and that he was giving of himself to die on the cross so that his perfect life would be applied to all those who place their faith and trust in Him. And that He didn't just die on the cross, but He rose again. And He is victorious over death and the grave. That He has power, and He is now seated at the right hand of God, ruling over all things. That's the gospel. It's the good news. It's the best news. It's the news that this isn't it. There's something else. There's something beyond the grave. And for those of us who place our faith and trust in Jesus, we don't have to fear death, because we know this isn't it. That's what the gospel is. Very clearly, Paul was cross-centered. He kept his eyes on the cross. He kept his life centered in the cross. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." He's cross-centered. Everything in his life is centered on Jesus and the cross. But not only that, but Paul remembered who he was before Christ saved him. He remembered what he used to be, what he used to do, what his life used to be. And it's important, if we're going to be cross-centered, to remember what things God has brought us out of. Now, I just want you to think about these things. Look forward to hearing your discussions online as you read chapter 1 and think about what it means to be cross-centered.